Kisukiukiet, everyone, and welcome to the annual general meeting for the Columbia Basin Trust. We're so pleased for all of you that joined us in person, and also want to take a moment to acknowledge and welcome those who have joined us online on Zoom and Facebook, where this meeting is being live streamed. On that note, many of us are now familiar with the technical challenges that can accompany a hybrid event like this. But please, if you do have any issues, and I'm speaking to people who are joining virtually, if any of those in person have technical issues, you are on your own. But for those joining virtually, if you have any technical issues, please reach out in the Q&A on Zoom or in the comments on Facebook, and Trust staff will try to help you out. My name is Jocelyn Carver, and I have the great honor of serving as the chair of the Columbia Basin Trust's Board of Directors. And in a couple of minutes, I'll introduce you to my fellow directors. And also later in the meeting, speaking to us will be our Trust President and Chief Executive Officer, Johnny Strelayev. Thank you all for being here today. This is just wonderful. So as promised, as advertised, I want to take just a moment to introduce the other directors on the Columbia Basin Trust Board. And perhaps as I do so, you could just kind of raise your hand and say hello to everybody. So Susan Hewitt from Caslow. Betty Ann Marino from Warfield. Angus Graham from Nelson. Ron Azust from Golden, or Rural Golden, as he likes to say. Christine Hushman from Cranbrook. Bill Van Iserloo from Castlegar. Owen Torgerson from Valemount.
Please be here.
Krista Turcasso from Fernie. Don McCormick from Kimberley, who is joining us online, as is Karen Hamling from Nakusp. And I would like to say just a special thank you and welcome to Director Cody Morajo, who joins us, of course, from her home community of Akam. So thank you to my fellow board members for all the work that you put in, past, present, and into the future. And with that, I would like to formally call our annual general meeting to order. It is such a pleasure, and again, a deep honor to be here in the community of Akam. And I would like to respectfully acknowledge that the land on which we gather is within Tunaha Amakis, and we are very grateful for the opportunity to do the work of the Trust in this important Tunaha community. Before we proceed, I also wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the significance of the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, also known as Orange Shirt Day, that takes place on September 30th, so just a couple of days into the future. This day honors the children who never returned home, the survivors of residential schools, their families, and their communities. We are hosting our AGM here at St. Eugene's Resort, formerly a residential school itself. And that carries a profound meaning for us as we reflect on this important day. We know that the legacy of residential schools is one of both deep pain and enduring impacts. And we're reminded of the importance in this context of truth, understanding, and a commitment to healing. Public commemoration and reflection are vital parts of the reconciliation process. And as an organization that serves the Basin, we as the Trust are deeply committed to our efforts to listen, learn, and support meaningful actions towards reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples. We're grateful for the opportunity to gather here today and to acknowledge the ongoing work of reconciliation across our region. The Trust owes its very existence to the water, to the land, and to the people of the Basin. And so it feels critical to acknowledge these roots as we move forward in our meeting today. So the Trust serves a region that encompasses all of the watersheds flowing into the Columbia River on the Canadian side. From Rossland to Fernie to Valemount, from Yakanuki to Akam to the Shuswap Band. The region is quite vast, spanning 80,000 square kilometers, and it's home to about 165,000 of us people. We're honored to serve all of these communities and the residents that live here. We're deeply grateful, too, to be an organization of Basin residents, your neighbors, our neighbors, who work together with passion, with professionalism, with prudence to guide the Columbia Basin Trust on our shared behalf. Let's take a moment now for a short movie that gets me every time about our founding directors who played such an important role in the creation of the trust. The video takes us on a bit of a journey about how various stars aligned so that these founding directors could keep their promises to Basin residents, to the people of the Basin, returning benefits to this region. So let's take a moment and watch the video.
It's perfect that we're meeting here right now. Besides the greatest drought since 1942, we're meeting here as the annual allowable cut is coming down, the smelter is dysfunctional, we're losing sawmill jobs all over the place, the coal industry is, as the gentleman said, in crisis. It is up to us to take the responsibility to figure out the way out of this box. And the reason it's worth doing is because, as Mo Sahota said, it's the most gorgeous, the most perfect, and the most community-minded part of British Columbia, and it is as worth saving as we are.
The fact of the Columbia Basin Trust is based on actually a miracle of coincidence, that if any one of those pieces had been missing, we would never have built this thing.
It's kind of miraculous that it all did come together. I'm not sure one person pictured the whole thing. Collectively, all the factors fell into place in an interesting way, and darned if we didn't get this amazing result.
Everyone said, well, it's almost like this thing where stars, all the stars seem to align.
For me, it started with watching discussions, political discussions on TV. And Grace McCarthy said that the monies from the dams, the extra monies that we would be getting from the United States would go all into the provincial coffer, but she never mentioned nothing about any local monies. I almost lost a television through that, and said, this isn't going to happen.
When the Columbia Basin dams were built, there was promises made to this region. Some of the brochures put out by BC Hydro in the province showed the types of industries that it would attract. And so when the downstream benefits were being announced that they're going to come back to the province of British Columbia because they were originally sold for 30 years, the region said it's time to deal with these impacts. These promises that were made have never come to fruition.
We saw the destruction that went on by other people to the river that destroyed the salmon that came into our region. That was totally in opposition to anything that we would believe in. If you affect one living thing, which is a river, and the fish, the effects are all the way down the line.
And the dust storms ended up being a health hazard for everyone living here. The mayor, Fred Demon from Golden, heard me on the radio on CBC. Then he phoned Josh Smink, and Josh Smink phoned me and asked if we would like to be included with just the formation of this Columbia River Treaty Committee that they were going to start. When the Fraser-Fort George Regional District came on side, that's when the entire basin came together. We were a group now.
And then everyone was saying, don't forget us. If you were going to do something, we're on board. We're going to work together on this.
We didn't really know what we wanted, so we had to get a mandate from the residents on what exactly we wanted. That is a lot of what the symposiums were about.
And I suppose our committee was committed to making certain that deals like this did not happen in the future with the repatriation or the sale of the downstream benefits, but rather that the community representatives such as yourself actually participate in the decision-making process, and that's why we're here today.
Because 30 years ago, those politicians thought they were making great decisions for the people of the future.
It wasn't just a bunch of municipal people whining that they didn't have enough money to fix their ball field or pave their roads. It was Caucasian and First Nations peoples coming together, which had not on any other subject ever happened here, to say the treaty is the central issue of our life, really.
So we were saying, like, how do we get involved in the way that there's a recognition of the damage that has been done, of what's been taken away from the Ktunaxa, and how do we bring that discussion to the table? And quite frankly, is anyone even prepared to listen to that?
I'm happy to see people gather here. I invite you into my country. Thank you.
Because you have to remember, this was way before the vocabulary of reconciliation was even considered.
You sit at a table with a union person and someone from social housing. Just couldn't help but gradually people begin to work more effectively together.
That's the level, the grassroots level, but it's not just one person's opinion that counts. It's the interaction of people's opinions that count.
And it showed, I think, Victoria, that the region absolutely was able to manage what might be provided to them.
It just seemed normal at the time, but I guess when you look back on it, it was quite extraordinary that we could foster that big of a conversation.
You get in a big room in the High Arrow in Castlegar or up in Cranbrook or something, and some of these people are the people who were flooded out and burned out, and they're going, will you give me back my farm?
I've been waiting for 25 years for this opportunity, and I think I better make use of it.
Well, in the 25 years of the Trust, I would say is the most emotional conversation I have been part of. I'm in a room and the chair goes, okay, shall we do recompense or shall we do the future? And the people in the room chose some kind of future vision. Set the tone, really, of what became the Trust.
Mr. Speaker, nothing today can right the wrongs done 30 years ago. We cannot go back and open the ears of the government of the day that would not listen to the people of the region, that would not consider the desires or dignity of those whose lives were about to be flooded under. We cannot replace the farmlands lost, the timber stands wasted, the homes and communities that were destroyed. What we can do today is offer the people of the Columbia-Kootenay region the opportunity and the tools to build a new foundation.
We recognize that there is the strength that comes from the land, and that together, working together as human beings that are here on this land, that we can do good things.
We were trying to figure out how to enact that principle that people who deal with the ongoing impacts of something to provide a benefit for the whole get a share of those impacts back to them to deal with those impacts. That's just a simple and frankly fair principle in society. We all talked about, yeah, we think we need legislation. So we kind of all looked at each other and we said, well, no, why don't we write our own legislation? So we did.
It was an amazing gall, right? Like, they hired a lawyer to write a law, not a paper, but a law. And the law said what would be created.
This was more an opportunity for people of the Basin and for the people on the CRTC team to try and build a consensus about what is right, and then to convince the provincial government that that was right.
I still remember Gary saying, we can never out-bureaucrat the bureaucrats. We need them to believe in us, believe in what we're doing, and join us.
This accord, this trust you're about to vote on, is to say, do we believe that a bunch of people out there on the land can decide for themselves what is the best thing to do in the decades to come to mitigate the decisions that people made in here? Thanks a lot, Honorable Speaker.
We were negotiating for about 15 months before the Columbia Basin Accord was signed. It was quite something because so many people of this region have been waiting for so long for something to happen.
And that was a particularly emotional moment. And there was just so much gratitude that we were actually going to finally deal with this issue.
I always looked at what's the end result? What are we trying to accomplish here? And we're trying to accomplish to get enough money to make it a significant legacy.
Order, please. The honourable members, the question is third reading of Bill 7, Columbia Basin Trust Act. All those in favor, please stand.
When the day of the legislation passed, it was absolutely exciting because we have reached this milestone now.
We have a picture of us all standing on the steps of the legislature. We actually had our first meeting of the trust in the legislature, in a little room once the bill was passed. How much of this was sheer kind of willpower and how much of it was luck? You got to be good to be lucky.
There are an awful lot of people in the region who are extremely well versed in the history and have a good sense of what's right.
In my lifetime, I found that those things that make sense are what you need to pursue. So that's the trust.
It allowed the people to write their own laws on their own tablets that they brought down from their own mountains. Nothing like that has happened in Canada before.
I think the moral of the story is, okay, local people can make it work and they didn't screw up. Those folks now can point to this institution called the Columbia Basin Trust and say, 25 years.
We never expected to get where we got. And so never discount your dreams.
To me, that is such an inspiring reminder of what we can achieve for current and future generations and the benefit we've received. This is our upstream. This is the legacy of the work that happened upstream from us, and we are the downstream beneficiaries. And who will we benefit downstream from us? What is our work together in the flow of the work of the Columbia Basin Trust? Okay, let's shift focus a little bit to motion, to move into the sort of the formal part of the annual general meeting. And I would love to get a director to put a motion to adopt the agenda. Oh, you could, but you don't have to because I already arranged for this to happen. That's our vice chair. He's really good at his job. Thank you, Betty Ann. Could I get a seconder? Ron, what a surprise. And thank you very much. Okay, so a reminder again, you know, there's such important core principle infrastructure that guides us here at the Trust, our mission statement being chief amongst them. So I want to just take a moment to ground us in the mission of the Trust, to support the efforts of the people of the Basin by creating a lasting legacy of social, economic, and environmental well-being with a view to greater self-sufficiency, both for present generations and future generations. So it's a big umbrella and a lot of good work already being done under that umbrella. As one resident shared with us during our recent community engagement sessions, the Trust doesn't speak for residents. It exists to ensure that residents' voices are heard. So we're here to amplify those voices and to support the initiatives that come from the ideas generated by those voices coming together. There is, as you saw in the video, really no organization. Honestly, we've done some research. We've never found another organization like the Trust. If you have, we'd love to hear about it because we love to reach out and join with organizations that share some mandates with us, including some that we're lucky to have here today. So because we're unique, there's both additional work and I think additional value in the work that we do together. But to note, we exist for the benefit of Basin residents. That is our sole mandate. And in order to do that, of course, sustaining the model of the Trust is important work for us. And we'll hear a little bit more about that as we give our annual report. At its core, in order to follow this mission and support this mandate, we do two things. We generate income so that we can take on the second function, which is to deliver benefits in the form of initiatives, programs, grants, and many other ways in which we support the region. Ensuring that the Trust is sustainable is a really critical part of the daily responsibility of trust board and staff. Every decision we make is made with an eye towards that sustainability and the stewardship of the work that we need to do, including the safeguarding of our investments. Our president and CEO, Johnny, will share more details about our approach to investment and how we generate income shortly. Okay, so together with you, our job is to make sound decisions so that we can continue to have thriving communities. And community engagement and feedback are obviously at the very heart of how we do that work. Earlier this year, we concluded our Columbia Basin Management Plan that spanned 2020 to 2023. And over the 4 years of the plan, through so many partnerships and collaborations with Basin residents and organizations, we, with them, have made a significant impact in local communities. Okay, this slide might be a little bit hard to read, but I think that is a sign of success. Because during this time, so first of all, there's copies in the magazine that you can pick up here. It's available online. And really at the highest level, what I would say here is this represents more than 10,300 projects, providing more than $320 million in total benefits, including capital investments, commercial loans, real estate investments, and grants, over the period of time encompassed by our last Columbia Basin Management Plan. And now we're embarking on a new one. The new plan sets the direction for the trust with a really primary overarching emphasis on health and resilience. The plan works in tandem with another foundational document that I'll mention, which is called the Charter. That's the enduring part of the management plan. We fold it into our management plan. It comes along with us every time we kind of reinvigorate our strategic objectives. And that outlines our mandate, our vision, our core values, and the foundational principles that are enduring for the trust. So during this management plan period, we're going to focus on these significant areas. So the stewardship of the trust itself, our relationships across the entire basin, the health and resilience of the communities in the basin, and that of the natural environment upon which we all depend and are part of. So as I mentioned at the outset, working with residents is essential to the success of the trust. To reflect the video again, that is what we are. We are a vehicle for the visions of the people of the basin. So in order to achieve this plan successfully, it will require ongoing engagement and conversation and question and answer and discussion and work with Basin residents. So we look forward to your active engagement in that discussion. I want to thank everybody who has contributed to shaping your communities. I suspect, the people who come to AGMs or come, join us virtually, they tend to be people who are engaged in their communities. And so I feel pretty safe in saying thanks for all the work that you are doing in your communities. We're so grateful to residents who continue to really invest of themselves and of their capacity in their communities in alignment with this management plan that we look forward to working on with you. And we want to appreciate your contributions to the basin and the diverse perspectives that you bring from across the whole region. And now, drum roll, please. I'm very pleased to announce and introduce Johnny Strelayev, who is our President and Chief Executive Officer, who's going to guide us through a review of the past fiscal year, the 2023-24 fiscal year. Thanks, Johnny.
Thank you, Jocelyn. Excuse me, I'm coming off of a bit of a bug, so if my voice cracks, appreciate your patience. As Jocelyn said, my name is Johnny Strelayev, and I have the true privilege of being President and CEO of Columbia Basin Trust. And I want to offer a welcome to all of you who have taken time out on a Thursday evening to join us here in person. And of course, those joining us virtually on Zoom and Facebook. And I'll also use this time as a reminder to those that are joining virtually, if you do have any questions, we will have a Q&A session at the end of the presentation. please feel free to drop those questions in the Q&A box in Zoom or in the comment section in Facebook, and we'll do our best to get to all of those, like I said, at the end. Okay, show of hands. Who's here for a 30-minute dissertation on financial statements? Bill's the chair of our Finance and Audit Committee. I'm glad his hand went up. This is the time in the presentation where I will share some highlights from this past fiscal year. It will not be dissertation style, but we do want to draw attention to some highlights, some achievements, and some of the challenges that we've experienced in this past year and will continue to experience through the remainder of this year. So before we start putting slides on the overhead, I also want to introduce David Bond, who is our lead auditor from KPMG. He's joining us virtually here today. And if there are any questions at the end of the session that are directed to our auditors, he's available to respond to those. So thank you, David. Okay, before the financial statements themselves, I wanted to walk through a few highlights. We heard Jocelyn describe Columbia Basin Trust and the structure of this organization, and I really do always need to remind folks that Columbia Basin Trust is structurally not a lot different than any other foundation or endowment or trust, if you will. We have part of the organization that manages a pool of assets or investments to generate a financial return, and then that return is available for the benefit of some body of beneficiaries. For Columbia Basin Trust, that investment portfolio I'll speak to in a moment, it is our sole source of earnings. That is where all of the funding comes from to support all of the great work that happens in communities. We are self-sustaining. As I was saying earlier, there is no rich benefactor, there is no taxation, there is no other revenue. It has to come from the management of our investments, and that's why it's one of our two core functions. So some of the highlights from the past year, the largest category of investment that we have in our portfolio is our 50% ownership in 4 hydroelectric projects in the West Kootenay area. And I'm going to be speaking in a little bit more depth about those projects and some of the challenges we've experienced. But they generate approximately 80% of our annual revenue. And last year, it delivered a return of about 8.25%. The second category of investment, we use some investment lingo, private placements, which is really just some fancy words to describe loans or investments in businesses in the Columbia Basin. So we do work with businesses in your communities, provide funding under commercial lending agreements. And we also own real estate in the region. Again, we do this to generate financial returns to be used for the other part of our business. So the private placement portion of our portfolio generated about 5.34% of a return last year. And the third category is what we call market securities. And this looks quite similar to what many will have had or do have in your RRSP portfolio, for example. So it is a portfolio of largely publicly traded stocks and bonds managed by a professional money manager. And that portion of our investment portfolio generated a return of 10%. So in total, when we add all of those up, last year we earned approximately $96 million in revenue, and it's really these earnings that allowed us to support more than 2,800 projects last year across about 60 different programs and initiatives. So out of that $96 million, 80.8 was driven right back into communities in total benefits to residents. About 53 million for grants and initiatives. So that is a significant part of that delivery of benefit function that we talk about. But it's not the only way that we can reinvest in communities. There's about 6.2 million invested in capital projects to support economic development initiatives, to expand the broadband network that we've invested in for several years now to bring connectivity to rural underserved areas of the basin. About $13 million in new loans to business and about 8.5 million in new real estate investments. Okay, so with that, we'll turn to the summary financial statements, and I'm just going to breeze through a few highlights here. This is our statement of financial position for accountants or finance people. This is commonly called a balance sheet. They tell me I can't call it a balance sheet anymore. But statement of financial position summarized that would show our assets, Columbia Basin Trust assets of 1.2, that is billion dollars. I add 3 zeros on the end and the thousands. That is the book value of the assets that we now own and manage on behalf of Basin residents. And the reason I emphasize book value is this is based on historic cost and accounting treatment. It doesn't represent the true market value. And what I can say very comfortably today to everybody here, the true market value is well more than double that. And again, a large part of that being our investment in the hydro projects. Boy, they're expensive to build though. And we did receive an endowment at the time Columbia Basin Trust was created in the mid-90s, but that wasn't enough to build these projects. So we had to borrow significant dollars over the years. That is the largest portion of the $684 million shown in liabilities. This is money owing to third parties that we have to repay each year, and it has to be an important consideration when we manage the entirety of our business, remembering always that we have that debt obligation. So the net accumulated surplus, or equity as it's often called on a book basis, is about $545 million. Our statement of operations, again, for accountants, that what we would formally call income statement, breaks down the sources of our revenue and how those revenues were used over the course of the year. The top line, as I mentioned earlier, power facilities and our return on our power investments are by far the largest revenue driver for your Columbia Basin Trust, about $79 million last year. The market securities portfolio that I mentioned earlier, about $6.5 million. Commercial loans and real estate and commercial investments, what I described as private placements earlier, 2.2 and 2.2 respectively. And then there's some other sources of revenue, and this is often funding that come from other organizations that we administer on their behalf. So approximately $96 million in total revenue, which is very similar to our realized returns in the prior year. What expenses? Well, as I mentioned earlier, delivery of benefits, those grants, the supports through initiatives were just over $53 million. As I mentioned also, we are a self-sustaining organization. We have to pay for everything coming from our staff to our corporate facilities. It's about $13.7 million. Financing costs on that north of $600 million I mentioned earlier of about $17.5 million. And the total expenses approximately $84.1 million, leaving an annual operating surplus of 11.5. Now, I often get questions. Folks will look and say, wow, that's a really large surplus. What this accountant prepared statement doesn't show is where we've invested money in capital assets. So as I mentioned earlier, our investment in expanding our broadband infrastructure, that's not reflected here. That's where a portion of that 11.5 million goes. Investments we've made in heritage assets in the region, many will be aware of the Creston grain elevators. We purchased those elevators and have made significant reinvestment to preserve that heritage asset in the community. That comes out of that. So I don't want to leave this impression that it's $11.5 million that was unused. That is just not the case. Okay, we wanted to share a little bit of historical information as well to show how the trust has grown over the years. This dates back really to our creation in the mid-90s, and the blue, if you're able to see, okay, the blue line across there is our revenue that's generated in any given year from the end of our first year in 96 all the way to the end of 2024. And we could see how that's grown over time. And the primary driver behind that was the construction and entering into a commercial operation at the 4 hydro projects that we have investments in. That's really driven those returns. What we're seeing now is over the past few years, the returns have stayed, revenue has stayed relatively flat. And that was expected. We knew that that was the case. We do not have any other large hydro projects under development. For the midterm, we expect much more modest revenue growth year to year. The reason I really like to share this graph, though, is to show the bars for each year. And what's shown on the blue area on the bottom, that is the amount to operate the organization, the costs for administration. The green, or the shade of green right above, that represents what we commonly call delivery of benefits, the grants and initiatives in each of those years. And then the top part of the bar represents capital, like I said many times already, broadband, other infrastructure investments that we've made. And you could see how it's tracked over those years, where the totality of those uses of money really on average comes very, very close to revenue, which is of course what we would expect. I had to check with my team earlier today to just confirm, but 2024 was also a bit of a watershed year. If we look back at the total revenue generated by the investments made by Columbia Basin Trust from the time of creation, in 2024, it exceeded $1 billion for the first time. So the cumulative revenue that has been generated crossed that threshold at the end of 2024. Okay. Like any investment, we have risks in our portfolio, and the largest portion being the hydroelectric projects that we have a 50% ownership in. We have a very robust operations and asset management program. We take each of these facilities down at certain times of the year to conduct inspections and maintenance to make sure that they continue to operate safely and reliably well into the future. And in April 2023, during that inspection, we discovered a very significant issue at one of the generating units at our Arrow Lakes Generating Station facility. It has 2 turbines, so imagine 2 identical power generating units. During the inspection of the first unit, we discovered an issue that required us to take that unit out of service for the entirety of last year, plus to effectively disassemble, correct, and reassemble that generating unit. This is an incredibly complex exercise. It is an incredibly costly exercise, not only for the repairs and everything that's required for that, but even more significantly, the lost revenue. We were very fortunate last year that our insurer, it was an insured risk. What gave rise to that failure was an insured risk. So we did have to pay for some of those costs, but by and large, they were indemnified by our insurer. So remember, 2 generating units, 1 unit had a problem. Gosh, we need to get into that second unit to see if that same problem is there. We started that work this year. And in fact, we were able to move through it quite quickly. Most unfortunately, we discovered a completely unrelated issue. That means now Unit 2 has been out of service since April, and it will continue to be out of service until the beginning of next year. We're forecasting sort of the March timeframe. What is much less certain is whether this will be an insured risk. We continue to work with our insurer to share the information required to make that assessment. But a key message that I am sharing with residents and organizations and all our partners is it is possible that this is not insured. And in the near term, we have to make some difficult decisions. The order of magnitude is 8 figures between the costs that we will have to pay and the lost revenue. And it may mean for a short period of time, we have to review budgets for other expenditures in areas like DOB. So it's not an existential threat to Columbia Basin Trust. This isn't a long-term issue. It's something we are dealing with now, and it may impact the work that we do in the short term, but I think it also acts as a real reminder that this organization needs to be self-sustaining. The money has to come from our investments, and from time to time, those investments won't deliver exactly what you forecast, and this is one of those times. Okay, so no more numbers, no more challenges. They don't actually tell stories. People tell stories. And of all the projects and supports that we were so proud to be part of this last year, we took a bit of a cross-section and pulled a video to share some of those successes as a real reminder and a grounding as to what Basin residents can accomplish in their communities and in the entirety of our region. And we wanted to share that video with you.
Timbers Landing is our new 30-unit affordable housing family complex. We were able to build this complex on time and on budget, and it has been really impactful to the Sparwood community, as we had no family housing that was affordable in Sparwood.
The wildlands trailer was recently purchased through a grant, which provides us with a way to move our equipment for us to fight interface wildland fires within the area of Radium Hot Springs.
The people that I've worked with helped really a lot in understanding, getting on board with the projects that we're working on. It really helped me like professionally and personally.
You know, I think it's sort of human, and I know certainly we find ourselves doing this, always looking to what's next, what's in the future. But I think it is important from time to time to just pause and look back and just think about all the amazing things that happen in our community. And from Columbia Basin Trust perspective, it's just such a privilege to play a role in supporting all that great work. We capture more of these stories in our annual Our Trust magazine, which acts as something of our annual report. And these were shared to all Basin households in August of this year. But certainly anybody who would like a copy, we actually have some here just outside the room, or speak to any one of our staff and we'll make sure you get a copy. Again, an opportunity to read some of the wonderful work, read about some of the wonderful work that's happening out in the Columbia Basin. Okay, so I think that concludes the presentation part of the AGM. As I mentioned earlier, those that are joining virtually, please, if you have any questions, submit them in the Q&A box in Zoom or include them in the comment section of Facebook, and we'll do our best to get to all of those. And an opportunity, of course, for anybody in the room who has a question, we'll do our best to address. Elder.
Thank you, Johnny. Thank you, Jocelyn. I have three things. One is to thank you to host the meeting here. I want people to know that CBT invested $7 million in this project when it started, and CBT never got paid a cent back, not because of our fault. I was working for Trabacas at that time. But I feel very good, very proud of the fact that you guys came and hosted the meeting in here. Thank you.
Thank you.
The question that I had was, with the renewal of the Columbia River Treaty, do you see an impact in inflow of revenue for the incoming years? So that's the question. And then I have a comment and concern, and I'm glad that Code is here. And I brought this issue several times before. The trust will be 30 years next year that will be in existence. For those 30 years, not one single Chunaha or Indigenous employee worked for the trust. This is bad. And I know that we have a diversified approach, and I also know that it's not only up to the trust to address these things. It's up to the tribal council and the Aboriginal communities to work with the trust so there is a relationship in place. So Indigenous people from the area can benefit from employment positions in the trust. So I encourage you guys to work together, and let's say that will be one of the goals of next year, to have the first Indigenous person to work for CBT in 30 years. So the question about revenues, so that's okay. The key one. Thank you.
I could take a crack, Jocelyn. So we're winging it here. So I hope you could be patient with us. Just on your first comment, Helder, thank you for raising that. When we talk about legacies, I'm not sure there's a greater legacy in the entire region than this place we are at today. And the trusts, it was very fortunate that the trust had the opportunity to make that investment, and look what was achieved. With respect to the Columbia River Treaty, the agreement in principle that has been drafted, it's been now shared publicly. There's going to be further sessions after the election with residents of the region to describe the content of that. So to be very clear, Columbia Basin Trust had no role in the Columbia River Treaty. We weren't at the negotiating table. We didn't have a voice. We did support efforts to make sure residents had the information that they needed in order to share feedback on what they felt was most important. We did invest in other bodies to be there for Basin residents, the most significant being the Columbia River Treaty Local Government Committee. But to be very clear, we had no role in the Columbia River Treaty. But that's not your question, Helder. We do not receive any money from the province of British Columbia any longer. We do not receive any share of Columbia River Treaty-based returns. However, under this new agreement in principle, it's entirely possible that the river system, particularly the Columbia River, is operated a bit differently than it is today. And when I say operated, I mean the release and the holding back of flows. It's entirely possible that there are differences. We own hydroelectric assets on those bodies of water. It may influence how and when and how much power we can generate. We have a commitment from the province of British Columbia and the CRT negotiating team to share information with us over the coming months so we could understand whether there are going to be any impacts. Perhaps there's positive impacts. That's still a bit of an open question, but that is a subtlety in as much as the way that river's managed could change, and that could impact how we generate revenue. And then on your third comment, Helder, certainly not disputing what you say, but in fact, we do have Indigenous employees today, and we've had Indigenous employees in the past. I don't know that I could say for certain any were of Ktunaxa ancestry, but we have had. But I think your broader point as well is something that we have a collective responsibility to keep in mind. So yes, thank you for sharing that. I don't know, Jocelyn, did you have any?
Yeah, I just wanted to add those questions are such good ones, all of them, and thank you for raising them. You know, I think the time we're in requires honest asking and truth-telling and conversation, and just appreciate you bringing it forward. And I remember you. We did some wonderful coursework together doing community development. It's great to see you again. Yeah.
Questions here? Yeah, before we go, please. We just have the mic out. I should just say we have the mic not for the room, but it helps those that are joining virtually hear the questions.
Hi, Keith Powell. Johnny, I've asked you this question before. I know you have assets in the West Kootenays, power assets. How about the East Kootenays? Have you considered, we do have several dams here, the Bull River Dam, the Elko Dam.
Yeah.
Both are languishing and need a little bit of a TLC, if we put it politely. Is that something that the the trust would consider in the future? And just one other point or question. Donald Trump recently said that the faucet would be turned on anytime and water would flow to California. And I think he was referring to the Columbia River. What impact potentially could that attitude have on our way of life here in the Kootenays?
Yeah, so maybe to the first question around where the hydroelectric investments are today and future opportunity. So the fact that the projects are located in the West Kootenay really tie to our history. So part of our original endowment included rights to put expansions in place at specific locations in the West Kootenay. So that was part of what was originally endowed to this region by the province of British Columbia. So that's part of that genesis. Very alive to projects in the East Kootenay area and in the northern part of our region, and in some instances, the state of those generating facilities. There's been a lot of work done at Elko to look at the feasibility of redevelopment of Elko. We were not leading that effort, but we're privy to some of that information. What does the future hold in terms of trust investment in new generation? That is something we're starting to look at with our new Columbia Basin Management Plan. It's actually set out as one of the objectives, looking at new opportunities for generation. But that doesn't necessarily mean it would be to the same scale of the projects we've completed in the past. So that's about the best I could answer to say it is now actually formally embedded in our plan and will be something that we're looking at. Jocelyn, did you want anything?
Yep. No, I just point to the kind of the specific line in our plan that does indicate, yeah, concerted effort to look at those opportunities where they make sense for Basin residents.
Okay, to the second part of your question, yeah, I'm gonna walk a tightrope here. So I'm gonna avoid sort of any political comment from a political perspective, but the way the river is and the system is managed in British Columbia is in accordance with an agreement between two countries. We have an agreement in principle to modernize that. On this side of the border, and talking to the chief negotiators and hearing from other senior elected leaders, there's a commitment to seeing that agreement in principle enacted, which would then govern how we manage that system. Some of the rhetoric that makes itself into the media from time to time, I often consider it rhetoric, because again, how we manage the system will be governed by agreements that are set out and approved by both nations.
I see a viral meme in your future, Johnny.
Yeah.
We don't really know yet what the specific unfolding of the agreement in principle will be. So there is a little bit of waiting to see, but there is information available on that agreement in principle that does point in the direction of how carefully managed and how some of those things will change from the kind of earlier version of the treaty to this new one.
So I do have a couple questions here from virtual attendees. Maybe I'll jump over to one of those. Hi, excited about the Connecting the Basin program to connect the great communities of the basin. Curious if you have any updates on work completed to date and work that may be planned. So it's possible this is referring to two, gosh, I wish this was somebody in the room, but somebody who's joined virtually, two areas, one where we've made significant investment and one where we're looking to do some more work in the future. If the reference here to Connecting the Basin is to our investment in fiber optic infrastructure, bringing connectivity to rural homes, the answer is yes. In fact, we just earlier, a few months ago, well, several months ago, announced a very large initiative under the Universal Broadband Fund that's going to bring connectivity to thousands of more underserved households in the Columbia Basin. We're actually starting that work today. It's going to take several years to complete that build. I believe it's 2027. I'm looking at Amy. Thank you. Spring of 2027 when that work is scheduled to be complete. It is such a significant need. I know as we stand in some of our larger communities like we are today, we don't have to deal with the connectivity challenges that so many people do. They still hear that crazy dial-up sound in some homes. I mean, that just sounds so foreign. If you're under the age of 30, you would look at me like an idiot. I don't know what you're talking about. But that's still there. So yes, the answer is yes, we're continuing to invest there. We've also used the language Connecting the Basin to talk a little bit more about physical infrastructure and non-motorized movement between communities. We have some incredible trail networks in and around communities. There is a really wonderful opportunity to come with a bit of a grander vision and something encompassing the entire Columbia Basin that would allow movement through trail networks from really the northernmost tip to the southernmost corner of this province. It's something that we've also included in our new Columbia Basin Management Plan. We're not yet in a position to talk about what kind of programs or initiatives will come out of this just yet, but it is very much in our near-term, on our near-term radar. So I'm going to keep, I'll watch for hands, but failing any questions here, I'll just keep going to questions online. This is a question from Matt. FortisBC has opened an expression of interest for IPPs. Will CBT build more plants? Brandon, is this possible? This is our Matt from the Power Operations team asking the question. Yeah, there's more than one. Okay. So yes, we are aware. FortisBC just recently released a request for expressions of interest that looks similar to a similar release from BC Hydro more than a year ago under a call for power. Both of those utilities recognize that they need to bring on new generation, perhaps a little bit sooner than they originally thought, in response to a growing population, in response to electrification, in response to a number of other climate-based initiatives. So we are very alive to those calls for power. Will CBT build more plants? I think I sort of touched on that a bit earlier. It is something we are starting to look at, where there are opportunities for investment in new power generation. I don't know that it would be in hydro. It could be wind, it could be solar, it could be geothermal, it could be some other types of technologies that we perhaps don't even really understand at the moment. But we're actually turning our minds once again to understand where there's opportunities. Those opportunities can only be taken advantage of if there's somebody to buy the power. Now we have FortisBC and BC Hydro saying that they do need it.
So that could be exciting. That's all I have to add.
Any questions from the room? Oh, I'm sorry. Independent power producer. Thank you. Please.
How is the energy security for the region and the growth that's expecting? Are we going to have to grow more? Are you prepared with this planning to fill that gap? Like, what kind of gap can we expect in 10 years, 20 years?
Yeah. So I can't say for you that we actually develop a regional power forecast. What I could say with a high degree of comfort today is if all the power we generate in this region was solely for the benefit of those who live here, we got way more than we need. The majority, in fact, virtually all of the power that's generated here powers other parts of the province of British Columbia. So think Okanagan, Lower Mainland, and even through the interior. So yeah, between Revelstoke and Mica in particular, massive contributors to the regional power, or to the provincial power grid. What does it look like in this region in the future? I think that's something we'd have to take a more detailed look at with the assistance of some experts in the space. But I don't think there's any reason to believe that we would be different than the provincial trend, where there's going to be a growing need for power for those same reasons. Growing population, electrification. Think about heat pumps in homes and electric vehicles in driveways and other initiatives in the climate space. So I do expect it to grow relatively significantly alongside the entire province of BC.
Maybe I'll just add from a sort of sitting around the board table perspective that when I joined the board, I did not anticipate the kind of depth and breadth of learning and responsibility that there would be sitting around the board table for how our revenues are generated. So understanding the hydro industry, understanding how to judiciously steward our own assets and what that means for the future and for future opportunities and future responsibilities. And it's heartening actually to have questions come up here that really do point to the generation and that kind of asset stewardship and opportunity, and really reflect that that's a growing part of the work that is happening at the governance level as well.
So I have another online question. The 2024 to 2034 Columbia Basin Management Plan does not appear to acknowledge the existence of nonprofit groups. Anecdotally, many nonprofits have spoken about decreasing CBT support. Did the engagement process earlier this year identify a need to support nonprofits? So a couple pieces of this. Gosh, I certainly apologize if there's an impression left in our management plan that suggests the trust is not available to nonprofit organizations in the region, because that just ain't the case. Nonprofit organizations would form by far the largest body of delivery partners and beneficiaries of trust funding in the region. So I certainly apologize if that's the impression. The second part, anecdotally, many nonprofits have spoken about decreasing CBT support. I talked earlier about the revenue situation that we're in today and how it is growing much more modestly than it has in the past. That means each year, when we bring forward budgets to our board of directors, trade-offs need to be made. So anything new that we look to support, oftentimes it means looking at areas that we've supported historically and perhaps scaling it back, or in some instances, discontinuing programs. And we are very sensitive to what that means to not just nonprofit groups, all Basin residents. It is a bit of a fiscal reality. They are extraordinarily difficult decisions, but we could expect that to continue into the future, and that reality that we evolve, we change, we need to be sensitive to the impacts of changes in funding, but we also need to be proud and looking to the future and acknowledge we do need to change and we need to do new things. And alongside that come tough decisions. But I should probably maybe overstepped because I think that's a board matter too.
Yeah. So I guess what I would add to that is certainly, you know, the board, that graph was very helpful in seeing this kind of like incredible rise in revenues and then tapering off. And that has come alongside a lot of difficult, challenging, important conversation and decision-making around the board table that also was confluent with a new Columbia Basin Management Plan. So there was the kind of these overlapping conversations about what, you know, how do we manage this sort of tapering of revenues, and how do we manage change, which is always going to be a part of what the trust will need to manage as best we can. I do want to acknowledge the challenge for many of our nonprofit partners who are doing such critical, important work in their communities that others are not doing. They're occupying very, very important spaces and doing incredibly important work. I just want to acknowledge it is always challenging to think about funding sources for the work that is done by 99.9% of these organizations. That's a constraint that is very real for most organizations. I just want to acknowledge it. It's a challenge. And we are very aware of it and always, of course, concerned about the well-being of nonprofits in the basin as well, and need to do our work at a basin-wide level, steward the resources, and make sure that we are directing them according to the strategic priorities that we heard from all basin residents. So that's the big overarching, and it does require the challenge of change to go along with it.
Please, Scott.
Thank you, Johnny and Jocelyn and your team for all your great work here in the basin. I just had a question about housing. I know you have real estate assets in your portfolio. I just wondered with, excuse me, some of the housing challenges that we're facing across the basin, if the trust has any plans strategically in the short or medium term to not only add assets to your portfolio, but to provide homes for people that live here. Thank you.
Yeah, I can take a...
Sure.
So that's a great question, Scott. The short answer is yes, absolutely. So some of what I describe in terms of investment assets, that does include homes or residents. A big part of the work we do in that space, though, is through our delivery of benefits function, often in partnership with other agencies like BC Housing or CMHC. And in fact, we have a partnership with BC Housing where we co-fund projects in all communities, Indigenous, non-Indigenous communities. We expect that work to continue and potentially even ramp up here with recent announcements from different levels of government. Now I'm going to get in front of the board of directors. So
wait, what?
We are, staff is bringing forward a proposal also to look at a different way for the trust to support housing development. We have some communities that are incredibly high capacity, very strong community organizations working in the housing space. All they require is a little bit of money to get it done. But that's not the case in every community. And those communities are getting left behind. They may have a community organization that is very capable to operate that housing development. But the process of working through development, construction, all of the proposals required to be successful through that is extraordinarily complex and risky. We can expect, I hope, an announcement in the near term about ways that the trust could ensure those communities are not getting left behind. Okay, you can scold me for that.
Yeah, that sounds good. Wait for that. When does that? That happens after 4, after 5. One thing I would add to that is, you know, Johnny's kind of preemptive comments about what we're about to talk about at our upcoming trust meeting are following exactly on the heels of how much feedback we got during the community engagement sessions from social and economic sectors, from communities who showed up at community conversations about how critical housing is. You know, when we're hearing from the economic and business sectors that housing is their #1 barrier to growth and expansion, we see an intersection there. And we really saw that in this last engagement process. And so it makes sense that we are starting to, based on that feedback, direct energies and resources there. And the second thing I would say is that we are so fortunate to have the trust operating in a partnership model in this space for so many years, because what we now have is a set of skills and the benefit of human resources in the people of the staff of the trust, that we can actually use that accumulated knowledge and skill to benefit communities that simply don't have the resources in this moment to do that, and to help support that. So for me, it's a watershed moment also in terms of, I'm sure staff have been doing this in various areas for a long time, but to see this come to a specific fruition in the housing sector makes my heart go pitter-pat.
So I see we're a little bit over time here. I do have a couple last questions that have come in virtually, so I commit to those who have submitted those questions. I will respond direct. I did want to share one of them, though. Jocelyn is such a lovely person to listen to. Seems like everything comes from the heart.
Johnny, numbers come from the heart.
Yeah, I know. That comment was submitted, I'm sure he wouldn't mind, by Am Nakvi, a former Columbia Basin Trust director that I know many will know. And then just before closing, I also want to encourage, as we wrap up this formal part, directors, I'm sure you're here and available to speak with anybody with questions, and certainly I am as well. So the Q&A doesn't have to end just as we bring the formal part of the presentation to an end.
So we promise to open the windows and doors.
Yeah.
It's getting cozy in here. Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much, Johnny, for, as always, knowing so much into such depth that answering these questions is like no biggie for you. As we come to a close, I want to thank all of you who are joining us here today. Again, I feel like it's something we can't say often enough. The community conversations that we had as part of engagement, that's like an example of the conversation we always want to be in. So please, with your questions and comments, continue to bring them to Johnny, to staff, to the board. I want to take a moment to thank the board and staff of the Trust, many of whom are in the room today, for their commitment to serve Basin residents and for the thoughtfulness and energy that they bring to their roles and responsibilities. There's almost no greater pleasure than working with wonderful people on meaningful projects that are mission and vision based, and those of us who work and serve the Trust get to do that. So thank you for the experience. I also want to thank all of us today. Thank you for joining virtually. Thank you for coming in person. Thank you for being residents of the Basin and for everything that you do for your neighbors, your communities, your families and friends. The achievements that we've walked through today, I hope you own them as your achievements, your Basin, your achievements, and we look forward to working with you in the future on more of the same. So on that note, can I get, I don't know, just surprise me, a director to call for a formal motion to adjourn? Krista, no way, awesome. And can I get a seconder? Susan, what? Okay, great, thank you. With that, I will bring the annual general meeting to a close and wish you all a wonderful evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you.